I'll be covering how to work with a MySQL database. Now, we've given the option of being able to work with a Microsoft SQL Server database and also then just your standard MySQL database as well. So I'm going to be covering the MySQL because I think that's the route that most of you are going to go because you will be able to work remotely. But before we do that, and the solution that I'm working with is going to be in the 1126 folder I have out in the VB Intermediate demo. There's going to be two. There's going to be one that's called Database MySQL, which is going to be the resulting code from after this lecture. And then there's going to be another one called Database MySQL _ no code. And the no code will be the one that would kind of be the starting point of what we're looking at now. And if you wanted to work along and try it yourself, I would start there. However, before we do that, there are some things that aren't part of the .NET framework that we need to install in order to be able to work with a MySQL database. If you go to Google and you search for MySQL .NET connector, the first link you're going to get is this MySQL download connector net. And you're going to come to this page, say download connector net, and you'll be given two options. One's going to be for an MSI installer, and the other is going to be for a zip. I would suggest going with the MSI installer. And you're going to download that, and it's going to take you to this login page as if you need to sign up for an account. But if you look down here, underneath the login, there is no thanks, just start my download. And so you don't need to sign up for an account, you can just download it from here. Now, at home, you only need to do this once. If you're working in the labs at school, because of deep freeze that resets the computers every time they restart, you would have to do this every time to set it up. But it's a relatively simple install. I already have it installed on this machine, so I'm not going to take it past this point. But once it opens up, and this is a reputable company, you don't have to worry about viruses or anything like that. You'll run it and just keep hitting next, and it's going to, what it does is it creates some libraries in your system's global assembly cache that allow us to be able to use that from within Visual Studio. So I'm going to close this down because it is already installed. And we will get back to that in a second. But let's talk about the form here for a second. I have on here a text box for a username and a password. And that's because the databases that you're going to be connecting to are hosted out on the Amazon cloud. And since this video is public, the repo is public, I don't want to publish those passwords because they would be able to log into our databases, and we don't want that. So this will be the username and password. If you're following along, check out on the Blackboard site. I'll have them posted there. And I have a little note here that says, don't publish these in your GitHub account. And that's something you need to be careful of wherever you go, is you don't want to store connection information, specifically username and password, inside source control. Mostly because it's going to change from environment to environment. But just on the offhand that someone isn't careful with that source control, you don't want to make that available to them. Okay, we have a query button that's going to go out to the database and grab our data, populate it into this list box, and then over here we're going to have some controls for adding a new message. Okay, so I'm going to go into my query button, click, and you'll see that in addition to the code that we just generated, I have this in a constant, a connection string. And it's very similar to the one that we set up for SQL Server, except you'll notice that there is the curly brace 0 and the curly brace 1. And those are placeholders for when we're going to use string.format to insert those values into our connection string. Okay, so as the first thing, let's do that. Let's get our connection info ready. And what I'm going to do is, because I know my username and password are going to stay the same, I'm going to hard code that into this text box here and this text box here, because I don't want to have to keep typing that through every single time. And what I want to do too, because of course this video is going to be public, is I want to be able to mask my input. So on a text box there is a property called password char, or password character. And this is like when you log into a website out on the internet and your username is visible, then you type in your password and it'll show up as asterisks. And that's how you would set this inside of .NET. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to set that for both of these, so that whatever I type in here will not be visible. And actually I'm going to take this off screen for a second here. What I'm doing is I'm hard coding in these text boxes in the .text property the username and password connection information. And again, check Blackboard for them if you don't have them already. I'll bring this back. Okay. So now inside of our button query, we know that our credentials exist on the form now. So we're going to pull those down and do our string.format for that. So I'm going to create a temporary variable that's going to hold that connection string for me. And I'm going to use string.format. Remember, string.format will replace string values in that string where we have those placeholder curly brace 0, curly brace 1, etc. So I'm going to use that as my format string, and then I'm going to pass in the values that I have off my form. So txt username.text and txt password.text. So when this line is done executing, I'll have a fully populated connection string right here. Okay, so we have that out of the way. Now, with how you connect to a MySQL database, it's very similar to how we connected to with the SQL Server database. With the SQL Server database, and I have the code that we covered in class here, when we were doing a query from the database, we needed to create a DB connection. That's a variable name, but it was actually of type SQL connection. We passed that our connection string. Then we created an SQL data adapter using the query that we wrote, our select star, and our DB connection. We used the data set, and then we used that adapter to fill the data set. In using the MySQL piece, and these are the components that we brought down, we'll be doing something very similar to that. But in order to be able to access those values now, you need to do an import statement. And you'll see that right off the bat, it becomes available to us. If for some reason you're not seeing this, and you should get this because you downloaded the solution that I put out there. But if, let's say, you're starting with a project from scratch, what you're going to need to do is inside your Solution Explorer, and I'll bring this up here, you're going to want to right-click your project, and you want to say Add Reference. And what this does is this will bring up a window that lets you go for libraries that aren't necessarily included in every project right off the bat when you build it. There's a Projects tab which would bring up any external libraries or libraries that are part of our project right now. But what we want is, and let me see if I can minimize this here. There's a .NET tab right over here that you can see. And so what I would do is I would click this component name one first to force everything to alphabetize, and scroll down, and what you are looking for is these entries right here. And specifically what you need is this one where it's MySQL.data. And you would select it and you would hit OK. And mine is already added, but if this is a new project for you, you're not going to get that error message. But what you'll see now, and you don't see it on the default view, if we went up into these buttons and we said show all files, there's actually a menu item called references, and if you click that down, this shows you all of the libraries that are being brought in to your project right now. And you can see in here I have MySQL data. If you don't have this, doing this import statement in the beginning is not going to work. You're going to type imports and you're going to say MySQL, and it's not going to show up in the IntelliSense. So as far as which ones we need to do, we need to say MySQL.data, another one for MySQL dot MySQL.data.MySQL client, and then lastly, to be able to use that data set, we need to import system.data as well. And this will make that available to us as we're typing. So following the same approach that we did for SQL Server, the first thing we need to do is create a connection object. I'm going to name this DB connection just like I did with the other one, but instead of an SQL connection object, it's going to be a MySQL connection object. And we're going to initially set this to be nothing because we're not quite ready to instantiate it yet. And later on, we're going to want to check to see if it is nothing. That means that it hasn't been initialized for us. I'm going to create a data adapter, just like we did for SQL Server. That one was called SQL Data Adapter. This one is MySQL Data Adapter. I'm going to create a data set that's going to hold the resulting data that we query out of the database. And then lastly, I'm going to define a string called query that's actually going to contain our query that we're going to be doing to the database. Okay, we got some lines here. That's okay. I'm going to want to put this all in a try and catch block. And this is because when you're connecting to a database, which isn't necessarily right down the hallway, it could be right next to you, it could be across the street, or it could be in a different state. A lot of things can go wrong between the time of you trying to make the connection to actually making it. So we tend to put anything that is a database connection inside of a try-catch block. And we don't have any sophisticated logging here. So instead, I'm just going to do a message box.show ex.message. And that's going to show us in case anything goes wrong. And we're going to put all of our code of us actually connecting to the database in between the try and the catch. Okay, so we have our connection string. The first thing we want to do is actually set up our DB connection object. So DB connection equals new MySQL connection. And here the default constructor wants to get a connection string. Now we don't want to give it the all caps connection string because that's a constant defined in the beginning, and if you remember, it still has those placeholder values in it right here. We want to use the one that we went through and actually formatted with the correct data. Next, I want to take that connection and I want to open it. Now every time you do an open, you should automatically do another close. And the immediate thought is that you would do, okay, well I'll put it down here right before all of the code is done executing to do it here. The problem with that is that if anything goes wrong in between the time you open it and when you're done, it's never going to get to this line. So we're going to do something inside of our try and catch block called a finally. And what this means is that no matter what happens in this code, this is going to run no matter what. It's going to run if it's successful, and it's going to run if it fails as well. So if it's successful, it does try, and then it's done here. If an error is thrown, it'll do whatever code is inside the catch block, and then it'll do what's in the finally block. So this is usually where we're going to always close our object down. However, what we want to make sure is that if this didn't work, let's say for example the connection string is wrong, when it tries to close this object, it's still going to equal nothing. And if we try and get it off of nothing, it's going to create another exception. And that's one thing to be aware of, is that even though this is in a finally block, if another exception occurs, it's not going to get caught. It will be thrown just like anything else, and it'll crash your program. So what we do is we're going to say if DB connection is nothing. And that's how we check to see if it is nothing. And specifically, we want to say if it's not nothing, then close it down. And so we say, in the beginning of this, we say if not DB connection is nothing, DB connection.close. And that will take care of all the scenarios of what can happen with that. Okay, next up, let's create our string, our query. So we're going to say query equals, and we'll keep it simple, select star from hello world. And actually it's not hello world, it is VBDemo. Okay. Next up, we have our query, we have our connection. What we need is to set up our data adapter. So we take DB adapter equals new MySQL data adapter. And that wants a query, and it wants the actual connection. This is exactly the same as what you do when you're trying to connect to a SQL server, but we're just using a different object. That one would be SQL data adapter. Ours is MySQL data adapter. Now that I have it, I can say DB adapter dot fill, and this is actually what will do the query that will connect to the database. And here I say fill DS, our data set. So after this line executes, that data is going to be inside of our data set right there. And so what we want to do is, now that we have it, we're going to want to display it. So I'm going to do a for each loop. I'm going to say dr, that stands for data row, as data row, in ds.tables0. A data set has the potential of being able to contain multiple tables, but we know because of our query it's only going to be pulling values in from one. So we say give us the first one at the 0 index. Then .rows is the collection of rows that are part of that table. Each row is going to represent a single record in the database that's returned by the query. So we go after the rows collection, so that inside of our for each loop, right here, is going to be where we are able to access the dr, which is going to be a single row for each in the result. So now what I want to do is I'm going to say lbdata.items.add, and then let's add as our key, as our field that we want, message. Alright, that should be everything. So let's run it. And I'm getting an error that says table vbdemo doesn't exist. So I think we have our name wrong, and it might have actually been hello world. I think vbdemo is the database name, and what I want is the table name. And yep, that is, because you can see up our connection string vbdemo is the database name, and what I'm after is the table name. So let's try again. And that's what I have. And that must be the only value that's in the database right now. So let me show you something with that now too, because what we are doing here essentially is we're creating a client application that's connecting to our database server. The connection strings that we're using here should be able to be used in any application that can connect to our database. And so what I'm going to run here is a program called MySQL Workbench. Those of you that have had data access for programmers or are in it right now will recognize this as something that you use to create the ERD diagrams. But what I can do is, and I'll set this up here, is we can, and yours might be empty already, but you can set up a new connection. And what you do is you use the same information that you used in the connection string inside of your application to set up a new connection inside of MySQL. So I'm going to call this one VB demo. I'll keep standard TCP IP. And for host name, whoops, we did not get that in our clipboard. For host name, it's going to be that IP in your connection string. For the username, you're going to do the same username that I got you. Again, I'm not going to put it in here in the video because I don't want to give that away. But what I'm going to do is, after I'd entered it in, you should be able to say test connection. And this isn't going to work because I have the wrong user and the wrong password. But you test the connection. Hopefully you have the right username. And then what I would suggest is save the password in the vault. And then you won't be prompted for it every time. I'm going to do this off screen, and then you can see what happens. And then when you're done, you say OK, test connection. You get the nice success window, and then you'd hit OK. Once you hit OK, it's going to be added to these. And this one at the bottom is the one that I just created. If you double click this, it's going to let you go in and take a look around the database that I granted you access to. In this case, this is our database, VB demo, and we can see that it has a single table, hello world. If I right click and select rows, it's going to return the only record that's in the database right now. And now usually what you're going to do is, because you're able to access through Workbench the same database that you can with your application, it also carries across all of the same permissions that you're granted to as well. So if you've been granted permission to do an edit or a delete or an insert with your connection string, you should be able to do the same thing from inside of Workbench. And what that gives us is a tool to be able to maybe manipulate some of the data when our application isn't quite ready to do that stuff yet. And that's always a problem, right? So if you're doing a query on a database and you're testing to see if the database is able to get the data out, and you want to post it to your form, how do you get the data in the database to begin with if your application isn't ready to do it? So often what you're going to do is you're going to go into their table here. You're going to right click the table and edit table data, and you can add some more values in here too. After typing it in, we're going to leave the ID field null because that will auto increment for us. Depending on the version of Workbench, if you're working on the ones at school, there's going to be a check mark up here. If you have the newer version, there's going to be a button down here called Apply. And you get to see the SQL that it generates, and you always want to look it over just in case, and then hit Apply. Assuming there are no syntax errors, if we right click our table again and say select rows, you'll see that it's part of that. And now if we were to go into our application and run it again, you'll see that the values that we entered in there are in fact displaying properly on our form. So that's working the query. The next thing we want to do is we want to say, well, you know, being able to access on Workbench is great, but I'd really like to be able to insert some of my own data through this application as well. So we're going to go to this insert button here, and it turns out that we can reuse a lot of this code. So I'm going to take everything that's inside of my button query click. I'm going to copy all of that out. Not move it, but copy it. And paste it into my button insert. Now, since we're doing an insert command, it's technically a non-query. It's more of a command object instead. So we're not going to need our data set because we're not pulling anything back. We're not going to need the database adapter, again, because we're not getting any data back. We are creating the data. We're writing the data to the database. So we can get rid of that as well. Now you're going to get some error messages. That's okay. We're going to delete these lines here because we're not doing a query and we're not pulling data out and we're not populating anything on the form. We're doing an insert. So in addition to that, we can get rid of our query object instead. So what do we have left? Well, we just have left our connection object. That's okay. We've reused the code that it gets the connection object, formats it with all that good stuff. And now we can just be left with concentrating on what we have to do for an insert. So whereas before we created a DB adapter, now we're going to create a command object instead. So I'm going to define a variable that's going to contain our command. We're going to just leave it as string.empty for right now. And we'll concentrate on the objects that we have to create. So when we create a command, again, I'm going to call it DB command just like we did with SQL Server. And instead of an SQL command, it is a MySQL command. We need to instantiate it, so we'll say new MySQL command. And what this one wants is it wants our command SQL, which is defined up there, and it wants the connection object. Very similar to the data adapter object that we've been using so far. And then after that, we say db command dot execute non-query. And this will take this command that we have here, and it's going to evaluate it and run it out to the server. So all that's missing is for us to build a string now. What I'd like to do is I'll go back into MySQL and I'm going to put another value in here. Right click, edit table data. I'm going to keep it simple. I'll say test2, test3. Hit apply. And look what it gives us. I said, oh, you should check it. But there's more to it. Is that Workbench generated this query. It doesn't do anything magical. It generates the query and it runs the query just as if it was something that we wrote. But it made this for us. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use that in our own application. It might need a little cleanup, but other than that, it's pretty much ready to go, right? Except for we have these values sort of hard-coded in, right? We have test2 and test3. We don't want every query to have that, so what we're going to do is we're going to replace those values, it's always in the values, with placeholder 0 and placeholder 1. Now, because we have that in there, this isn't going to work until we put our values in. Let's go back to our form, and we have a field for message, but we don't have one for name, and that's something also that we wanted to update. So I'm going to borrow this text box here, get rid of the password character and the text. So this will be the name, and this will be the message. So I gotta name this txt name. There we go. Okay, so what I want to do is I have my 0 placeholder and my 1 placeholder. I'm going to pull that value back out. I'm going to say string.format command, and we're going to use those values. So it wants message first, so we say txt message.text, and secondly it wants name txt name.text. This will have a properly formatted command now. Okay, no error. Hit query. And we have, this is a new message. In addition to, you'll see it has our other values in there too. So what's happening here is we're not clearing out our text, our list box, so we have to throw that in there as well. So on query click, before we add the items, we should say lb data.items.clear. So now, if we keep clicking it, it's going to refresh properly. Hit insert, hit query, and now we have that on there as well. So it's not all that different from how you would do it in SQL Server. And it's mainly different from doing a normal query. Is instead of doing the MySQL data adapter, you're actually working with this MySQL command object. And you're building the string. Instead of hello star, we're using our insert statement that we used from MySQL Workbench to build for us. Okay, so we have an application that will query the database and let us insert a new record as well. What we will do next is we will work on having this part populate with that data pulled from the database depending on what was clicked over here, as well as update and delete.